Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Welcome to Jesus 101. Thank you for joining us. Today we are discussing the topic of grace. Grace, of course, is the basic topic on which every other story of the Bible is based. As a matter of fact, you can find grace from the first chapter of Genesis all the way to the last chapter in Revelation. And what is grace really? How do we define grace? Well, today I'm going to tell you a story about grace that has to do with a pair of scissors. But first I'm going to define it for you. Justice is when you get what you deserve. Mercy is when you don't get what you deserve. And grace is when you get what you don't deserve. So there are three levels of things. And justice is the appropriate retribution for what you have done. Mercy is when what you deserve is being held from you. Like if you deserve to be 3 months in jail and you get mercy and you don't go there. But grace is when on top of everything, you receive something that you should have never gotten. And that's what grace is. Now, why is a pair of scissors a symbol of grace for me? Well, my parents were very graceful people. And one time something happened to me. I was a young woman and I decided I knew better than my mother. See, my mother is a person who is very handy. She can do things with flowers and she can do things with all kinds of manual handy things. And she can cut hair very well. But one day I decided that I knew better than her. So I said to her, you know what? You're not going to cut my hair. I'm going to cut my own hair. So I picked up a pair of scissors and I went into the restroom and I locked myself. I was a young woman, probably in my early teens. And I started cutting my own hair. And very soon I realized I was in trouble. I probably had 2 inches left of hair in all my head. And I said, I can't fix this. And I was so, I don't know, for a girl at that age, what that meant for me. And so I finally decided I needed to ask for help. And I thought that when I came out of the restroom, my mother was going to say, well, there you got it. I told you that you couldn't do it. And now, well, you're going to have to live with that. That would have been justice. Or she could have helped me not to have the consequence and give me a wig or something. But on top of that, she said, come here. She sat me on the table in the kitchen. She took the scissors in her very skilled hands, and she cut my hair. And even though I ended up with a very, very short haircut, I could not believe that my mother, after what I had done, on top of that, she had helped me so that I would, look at least decent. We went out to celebrate when it was all over. Grace is when you get something that you never expected to get. And today we are going to talk about David. David is the great king. This king is called a man after God's own heart. This king, even though he made many mistakes, acted with such grace so many times in his life. And we are told in the scriptures that from a descendant of David, the Messiah would come. So when we get to the New Testament, especially in the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, we are constantly told that Jesus is the son of David. As a matter of fact, if you want to take some time, go look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, and see that the first name that is in the genealogy of Jesus, right away, when the book starts, says, this is Jesus, the son of David. Because there was a covenant that God had made with David, that his throne would be forever, that there would be a descendant that would have the throne forever, and of course that was Jesus. So many times, David will act in a way that will teach us about the plan of salvation. And today is one of those stories in which we see a graceful part of David that is really unbelievable, especially for the customs of his time. So let's go now then for the story of Mephibosheth. But before we get into the name, let me tell you what had happened between Jonathan and David. So we're going to pick it up on 1 Samuel chapter 17. Right after we get Goliath and the great victory of David with Goliath that we have seen the previous episode, now we get a covenant between Jonathan and David. So I'm going to read this covenant to you. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 3. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him. So here I have something like a royal robe. This was very important because Jonathan is actually saying to David, I know that even though my father Saul is the king, you will be the one succeeding him and not me. So when Jonathan took his robe, and we are told in the covenant that he also took his armor, and including his sword and his belt, and he put all of this at the feet of David and said, I know, David, I know that the Lord has chosen you to be the king of Israel. So in this selfless act of Jonathan, the first covenant between Jonathan and David occurs. Now, this time of David's life will be a very difficult one. You know, in the previous chapters, David has been anointed king. But perhaps the hardest times in anybody's life is between the anointing and the appointing. In this case, David had been anointed king, but he won't be appointed king until a long time afterwards. And this period of waiting in which you don't know what's happening because the Lord has told you you're going to be king, in the case of David. Or maybe in your case, you know you have a calling from God. You feel called to go to the ministry, and then you finish and you don't have that call to go to a church. Or I don't know, whatever circumstance you're going through. The period between the anointing and the appointing is a very hard one, is the in-between times. And in the case of David, we call it Cave 101. Cave 101. The time in which God worked in his heart through the caves and the strongholds and the darkness that surrounded him. Even Saul persecuted David during this time. And I like a phrase that I read in a book on brokenness based on this story, that it says that God used Saul to kill the Saul in David, so that David would not be Saul when he got to the kingdom. So this covenant that Jonathan did with David starts a period of David's life when he will have to run away. But he will have this covenant, the covenant that actually Jonathan made, the son of the king, can you imagine, who was supposed to be the king. He said, no, I know that God has chosen you instead. So he has the sword and the royal robe when he goes to the cave. But before that time, one more time, they will have another covenant and between David and Jonathan. And now David will say something very interesting because Jonathan says, please make this covenant with me. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 14. If I'm still alive, says Jonathan, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? Because he's sure that David will be king. You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever. You shall not cut off your grace from my house forever, says Jonathan. I know you will be king. Not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David and David's enemies. And David said, yes, I will do this. I will preserve the life of Jonathan and all his descendants. So these two covenants that we have come in a period that will really encourage David, because after this he will go to the strongholds and will be persecuted by Saul and all of that very strongly for a long time. But he knows that the Lord has chosen him to be king instead of Jonathan. Very good. Now, what's going to happen now? Well, we're told that in the last chapter of 1 Samuel that eventually Saul and Jonathan died in a battle. And something happened because at that time, if you were king and you have any descendant, I have a little baby here that we're going to use as the descendant of the king. If you had a little baby, even if he was a just born baby, they would kill all the babies anybody that could be a descendant of the previous king, the new king would take over if it wasn't of the same family line. And something happened in this story, we are told, in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, that when Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in the battle, there was a little baby, very, very young baby, that was the son of Jonathan. But when this happened, they thought that whoever the new king would be, they would try to get him. And the nurse that was nursing this baby, something happened to her. Let me read it. 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. And we're going to be told why he was crippled. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And when she ran, she dropped him. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. From this day forward, this little boy would be lame. That's why we have put things in the legs of this little doll, so that you remember that not only is he the son of a would-be king, therefore he would be an outcast in this society, but also he's lame, which at that time it was interpreted as cursed of God. So this man, when he grows up, will be an outcast in every single sense of the word. He will be isolated outside of the king's court. He will be lame, considered handicapped many times because of the will of God. They would have considered it. And on top of that, he could never show his face because he was afraid of the new king. What a way to live, isn't it? Perhaps today you think you're in that spot, that everything has gone just wrong in your life, that you're nobody and that you will never be anybody. Well, I'm sure that Mephibosheth thought that. And this little baby grew to be a grown-up man. And when we find him again, something is happening, and David is now king of all of Israel. In chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, David becomes the king of both kingdoms, the north and south. And now he's the great King David. And one day, David wakes up and says, I want to do something nice today for the sake of Jonathan. And this is what happens. Chapter 9 of 2 Samuel is where actually our story will start. And this story will tell us what happened to this little baby who was crippled in both feet. Chapter 9 of 2 Samuel says this. David said, is there anyone left of the house of David that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Can you imagine saying, is there anybody, any descendant, anybody left that I could show kindness to them? You know, he didn't know about this little baby that was lame. He didn't know that. So he says, I want to show kindness to somebody that is a descendant of Jonathan's for Jonathan's sake. And so here we have the response. Verse 2. There was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. Now imagine what fear would have Ziba and everybody else had of this new king, because they were not related to David. And they thought that David would exterminate everybody. That would have been considered justice at that time. If you were a descendant of the previous king and you were not killed, that would have been considered mercy. But look what David would do. Verse 3, the king said, is there not yet anyone in the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet. Oh yes, says Ziba, there is a grown-up man who used to be a little baby, crippled in both feet. Now Mephibosheth, that's his name, has a son already. So many years have gone by. Can you imagine being known just by this identity? We're not even told the name here. Yes, there is a son of Jonathan who is a cripple. Has that ever happened to you, that you are called by the failures in your life, not by your name? Oh, there goes the divorcee. Look at her. Oh, that's the jailbird over there. Oh, he's an adulterer. People don't even know your name. They just know what you are destitute for? Well, that's how this little baby that is now a man is introduced to David. So here Ziva says, yes, there was a little baby who got crippled in the feet, and now, well, he's a grown-up man, and I don't even know where he is. I think he's very far away from here. Of course he would be. Verse 4, the king said to him, where is he? And Ziva said to the king, behold, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar. Lodabar means desolate land. And it was a trans-Jordan, which means that it was on the other side of the Jordan. It wasn't on the territory that would have been close to Jerusalem. Can you imagine this poor man, crippled, son of the wrong family, now has gone to a desolate place far away, so nobody will know him or see him, and he will be away from the possibility that somebody would do something to him. Oh yeah, he lives over there in Lodabar, desolate place. Actually, you could also translate it without pasture, the dry place over there. I know that difficult times in our lives sometimes make us feel like Mephibosheth, like we were born in the wrong family, or the things didn't work out, that we're so handicapped, if not physically, emotionally, because of things that have happened to us, and perhaps spiritually. Here David acts like God, going after the one who was not deserving of anything in the customs of that time. Can you imagine that day in Lodabar? The King David, verse 5, sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel from Lodabar. Can you imagine that day in Lodabar, a little town in the other side of Jordan? All the limousines or whatever they were in the time of David, camels or whatever they were, having this caravan coming into town, and everybody being afraid of this new king. What are you looking for? We're looking for the lame. You mean Mephibosheth? The son of Jonathan, the son of the previous king? Yes, that's who we're looking for. And they bring this man who was lame until that time. And they bring him to the place of the king. And so he's trembling. He thinks that the king is going to get him. Verse 6, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. Of course, he was so fearful because he thinks David is going to kill him because he's a grandson of Saul. And by the way, it wasn't just the previous king. It was the king who made David's life miserable. Well, he prostrated himself, and David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, here's your servant. And this is what David said. Wow. The first thing he seeks to say is to relieve him of his anxiety. He says, do not fear, Mephibosheth. Don't be afraid. I want to do good to you. I don't want to do bad. I want things to be different for you from now on. And he says, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you. Why? For the sake of your father. Of course, he remembered the covenant. He remembered when Jonathan said, I know you will be king after me, and please take care of my descendants when I'm no longer around. And David said, for the sake of your father Jonathan, I will restore you all the land of your grandfather Saul. Can you imagine? Not only did he not get justice, which means that he should have been killed in the customs of that time. Not only did he just get mercy, which means that he did not get killed, but at least he was allowed to live over there in Lodabar. No, now he's starting to get grace. And what grace this is. First of all, he's going to get back all the land that belonged to his grandfather Saul, who was the king before. But that's not all, says David. You shall eat at my table regularly. From now on, you will sit at my table, says David, and you will eat the bread of the king, and you will drink the cup of the king. Because from now on, Mephibosheth, you who were thought to be destitute and desolate and cursed, from now on, you are going to be the son of the king. Can you imagine this man? This man didn't know what was going on. Verse 8. Again, he prostrated himself, and now with a different spirit. Now he realizes he's receiving grace. He's receiving another chance. Before I continue with the story, some time ago, a young woman called me and she said, I want to know if I did everything wrong up to this place this time in my life, can God still bless me? She says, what? Let's say that I slept with many men and I wasn't married. Can God now bless me with a good marriage? Can He do that? Let's say I spent a lot of my life doing other things. Can now God use me for His kingdom? Is there such a thing? And we sat down with this young woman, and I said to her, have you heard of the story of David and Bathsheba? Have you heard that David committed murder and adultery related to Bathsheba? And that of all the wives that David had, God could have chosen any of them to give them the son who would be the one that would succeed David. But He chose Bathsheba, the very woman with whom David had committed adultery and then killed her husband Uriah. And you can read all of this in 2 Samuel. And from that union came the wisest man who ever lived on this earth, King Solomon. See, when Jesus died on the cross, He didn't just pay for our iniquities or for our sins. Oh no, He did a lot more than that. The price, the punishment for our peace was upon Him. And through His stripes, we're healed. That's why grace gives you what you don't deserve. That's why grace has given me what I don't deserve. That's why that day when David told this man that he would eat at the king's table, he was showing what the grace of God is. And so this man in verse 8 of 2 Samuel chapter 9, again he prostrated himself and said, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? He was using self-deprecating terms about himself. And the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I had given to your master's grandson. So now Ziba, take care of the land. And I'm sure there were many people that were very happy about that were in the family of Mephibosheth. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate that land for him, and you shall bring the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. So he appointed Ziba to work on the land and bring the profits to Mephibosheth. So all of a sudden, Mephibosheth now is not only sitting at the king's table, but he's going to be rich because he has land again, which will have fruit, and Ziba is going to bring the money. Verse 11, then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. From that day on, Mephibosheth would be the king's son. And this chapter ends by saying this, the last verse, 13. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly, and he was lame in both feet. The juxtaposition of the fact that now he was rich in so many ways, even though he was lame, is one of the most beautiful pictures that we have in this story. Now, let me tell you this. Mephibosheth, now sitting at the table, David's table, who had been disabled, physically, emotionally, spiritually outcast, now is one of the king's sons. This whole story shows the history of redemption. See, God has made a covenant with us. And He made the covenant the day we got crippled, the day that the children of God followed the kidnapper in Genesis chapter 3. See, God had children in his image, as we have seen in some of our previous programs. We were in his likeness, but we followed the kidnapper. And on that day, when we chose moral independence, we became handicapped. Our nature was now the human nature. Now we could not do the things we could do before. Now we didn't have the thoughts we had before. Now we were weak. And at that moment, God makes a covenant because we are in his image and he's our closest of kin. And he says, you know what? I will do for you what you can't do for yourself. I will rescue you because you can no longer run. You can no longer do many things. And God says, I will make a covenant with you, just like David made a covenant, that he would save the descendants of the human race. And that's why then Jesus said, look, I will do for you, and one day, what you can't do for yourself, and one day we will be together again. The Bible ends when the children of God are back with him in paradise. When he can hug them again and he says, I will be your God and you will be my son. And actually, let's read it. Chapter 21 of the book of Revelation. It's a very loved verse that says that he will wipe every tear from our eyes and that death will be no more. And then he says, let me read it to you. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no longer any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And then God says, he who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. See, this was the original plan of God. You know, every time I take communion, which is a symbol of Christ's sacrifice, I remember that I've been invited to a banquet. I remember that God has said to me that I will be eating in the Messiah's banquet at the end of times, that there is a place there reserved for me. And every time I eat of the broken body of Christ and I drink of the cup that symbolizes his death, I am reminded of the grace that God had when his son came and died on my behalf. Now, can you imagine the first time that Mephibosheth sat at that table, in the king's table, and his lame feet were just kicking under the table with the happiness of being now a son of the king? Well, if you can imagine that, then you can imagine heaven. Because all of us in heaven would be there, having been lame in the past, now sitting at the king's table because of the blood of the Lamb.